Grace and peace to you from our Lord Jesus Christ. Our text tonight is 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 21b to 29. 21b, the second half of verse 21. The first half of verse 21 went with the previous section, where in chapter 11, Paul spends 21 and a half verses, as we count them, 21 and a half verses, getting up the gumption, you might say, or explaining why he has to boast. He tells us, okay, I'm going to boast, but I don't like it. I'm going to boast, but it's kind of playing the fool. It's kind of playing their game, the game of the super apostles. I'm really not into this. This is not how I want to do ministry. But you have forced me into a corner, as it were. And now I need to boast, because that's what you expect. You, given your cultural context, you expect some kind of triumphalistic boasting about success, capacities, abilities. And Paul is frustrated by that. He doesn't want to boast. He calls it playing the fool. But because he loves the Corinthians, because he cares about them, he's going to engage in some kind of boasting. It may not be the sort of boasting they expect to hear, but it is a boasting that responds to what the Corinthians are engaged in, what the Corinthians are involved in with these super apostles. And so for 21 verses, Paul kind of explains that and basically says, I'm going to do this because you have people among you who are manipulating you, exploiting you, slapping you in the face, domineering you. And that's got to change. And so I'm willing to go to this length in order to share with you why you should listen to me. I shouldn't have to do that, basically, Paul says. I'm your father in the faith. I planted this church, I've nurtured this church, I've watered this church. And yet these super apostles have come in, they are intruders. We don't know exactly when they came in, but they're intruders. And they've kind of disrupted whatever harmony there may or may not have been. But they've become the focus. And particularly the focus of Paul's attention here in chapters 10 to 13. So I'm going to boast. I don't like it. I think it's the wrong strategy. It's not where the emphasis should lie. But I'm going to do it for your sake. But I'm going to do it, as we'll see here, I'm going to do it in a different way. I'm not going to play into your expectations. I'm not going to mirror the exact sort of thing that perhaps the super apostles are doing in their boasting. So in chapter 11, verse 21b, second half of 21, Paul, as it were, begins his boasting. Let us read from the word of the Lord. But whatever anyone dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool, I also dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I'm talking like a madman. I am a better one. With far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless floggings, so often near death. 5 times I have received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. For a night and a day in the sea, I was adrift. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from bandits, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers and sisters, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, hungry and thirsty, often without food, cold and naked. And besides other things, I am daily under pressure. I am under daily pressure because of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak? And I am not weak. Who is made to stumble? And I am not indignant. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So there's some kind of matching of boasting going on here. And that's why Paul uses kind of the word better. And we'll get to that word in just a moment. Or the way he begins, where he asks, are they Hebrews? So am I. In other words, he's matching them in some way. The super apostles have come into the space with a kind of credentialed resume. They're Hebrews, they're Israelites, they're descendants of Abraham, they're ministers of Christ. So these are Jewish, we presume they are Jewish ministers, Jewish traveling evangelists, Jewish messengers of some kind who are Christian. They are ministers of Christ. They are proclaiming a Jesus. They are proclaiming a gospel. As we saw earlier, it's a different gospel. It's a different Jesus. Not so much necessarily in the content, though it could be, but not necessarily in the content, the actual teaching itself, but in the style of ministry. They have a different sort of ministry of reconciliation. They come in credentialed, they come in boasting of revelations, they come in boasting of whatever their success or their rhetoric, they can speak better than Paul. They have all the Greco-Roman markers of success nailed down, which is sort of what Greco-Roman Corinth might have expected in a credentialed messenger, a credentialed servant of Christ, minister of Christ. And so Paul is going to mirror that boasting, but then he's going to break off from it. He's going to mirror it and say, oh, well, you're a Hebrew, so am I. Now, we don't know exactly what that means. It might refer to the fact that he is a Hebrew speaker, that he reads the Torah in Hebrew, that he attends a Hebrew synagogue. In other words, he's immersed in the Hebrew language. Or it might mean something about his pure ethnicity or something of that nature. Maybe. We just don't really know. We know that there were kind of Greek synagogues and there were Hebrew synagogues. Presumably that has something to do with language, maybe even some practices, but we don't really know. But we do get the sense, though, that the claim that you're a Hebrew is an exalted sort of thing. That's something that people boasted about, apparently, especially these super apostles. We're Hebrews. Paul says, so am I. Well, we're Israelites. We are descendants of Abraham. We are Israelites. We are a part of the covenant people. We are the one to whom the promises belong. Paul says, so am I. We're descendants of Abraham. That is, we trace our lineage back to Abraham. Paul says, so do I. We're ministers of Christ. Paul says, so, well, he doesn't quite say, so am I. What he says is, I'm better. I'm a better one. Now, the word minister here is the word diakonos, which is deacon, sometimes translated deacon, but also can just mean kind of generally a servant. Describes people who wait tables, comes out of the service industry, you might say. That these are people who are helpers to others, serve others. Could be used, it's used more kind of about employment or something like that, but it could be used of even of enslaved people. But I think we're probably a general figure here, general metaphor. Minister of Christ. So these super apostles thought of themselves in that way. They are ministers of Christ. And Paul says, it's not just so am I. He says, I'm better. Now that might sound like a really arrogant claim, but it's really kind of an ironic claim. Because the name that Paul's given to this group of intruders is super apostles. And super apostles uses the word that we would call it hyper apostles, perhaps. It's the Greek word huper, which in English transliteration would be something like hyper. So Paul is calling these the hyper apostles in a superlative kind of way. What Paul says here is, and I'm better. And Paul uses the word huper when he talks about more labor, huper labor, more imprisonments. The huper describes Paul's ministry. And in fact, it describes Paul's suffering. He thinks of himself as a better apostle or better minister of Christ is the language he uses here. He thinks of it as better in the sense that there's more, there's huper, there's more suffering involved in his ministry. So he's going to boast here, not about, oh, okay, I'm a better minister of Christ, so let me tell you, here are the things I teach, here's my commission from Jesus Christ himself, here's my conversion experience, here's the letter of commendation I've received from other people, or here is the commission I was given by the apostles in Jerusalem. He doesn't go down that list. What he says is, more. And he starts listing what we might call his suffering or his ministerial practices. Not so much in terms of what sort of things did he do in a church, but rather his ministry of affliction, of suffering, of what he has endured, which I think is the primary point. He is a better minister, not because he has these credentials, some kind of external credential, though he could list some. His commission from Jesus Christ, his seeing Jesus on the Damascus Road. I mean, that's pretty high level kind of credentialing there. But he doesn't go down that road. Rather, he goes down the road of, look at my ministry. Look at how my ministry is played out. Look at what I have endured. So Paul ends up boasting in his endurance, not so much in his credentials. And that seems to be the difference between the super apostles and Paul. And that's why he's better, a better minister of Christ. And if we look at the suffering that he describes, it falls into kind of four categories. A lot of commentators have noted how the description is perhaps organized in a way. Letter writing in the ancient world is not sort of like our letter writing, where we might write grandmother or we might write our wife, and we write it with a stream of consciousness. Sometimes ancient letter writing was that for sure, but ancient letter writing was also about the secretary or amanuensis, a a person who would actually write it down as we dictated it, and we could make changes as it was dictated. And so you could craft the letter more carefully. And in crafting the letter more carefully, you can use rhetorical devices. And I think Paul does that here. This is not just kind of, well, let me tell you everything I went through. It seems like, and others have recognized this as well, that he says, here's one sort of thing I've been going through. Here's another sort of thing I've been going through. Here's another sort of thing I've been going through. And we have kind of 4 categories, and then we have a 5th thing tacked on at the end. The first category that we see is in verse 23, where he says, far greater labors, far more imprisonments, countless floggings, and often near death. In other words, this is his suffering in ministry. Labors, probably his mission work, maybe, which led to imprisonments and floggings and led to being near death. So we have this sense of Paul's suffering, his, I'm trying to find the right word here, his experiences of opposition. Or it might be that this is kind of a generalization here that covers everything he's about to say. Because his next category is an enumeration. I don't mean he enumerates them 1, 2, 3, 4. I mean, he names them with numbers. 5 times I've been flogged with 39 stripes, right? That apparently refers to some floggings that he's received at the hands of Jewish authorities, maybe some synagogues, or maybe in various places across the Mediterranean world. We don't know exactly all the, we can't count these 5. We can't, oh, there's the 5 of them there in the book of Acts. No, I mean, we can't do that. But Paul's telling us 5 times he's received 39 stripes, which had to come, which is generally the practice of Jewish authorities when they're disciplining some of their own people. Or then he says 3 times beaten with rods, which seems to be a Gentile sort of thing, a Greco-Roman sort of thing, that to receive a beating with a rod is to be beaten across the chest or across the back. Maybe it's similar to kind of caning practices in the history of recent states, like in Singapore. But this was a practice of the Greco-Roman world. And 1 time a stoning. Now that one is recorded in the book of Acts, and if you remember, he was stoned to such a degree that he was thought to be dead. Whether he actually died and was raised, or whether he was thought to be dead and was able to get up and walk back into the city, that's debated. But the point here is Paul has been near death. Even these floggings could bring you near death, and these beatings could bring you near death. But typically they were more for punishment, more for a chastisement, you might say. But the stoning was intended to kill him near death. And then he says, well, I've been in 3 shipwrecks. Now, this doesn't even include the one in Acts, because the one that we're told about in Acts, like Acts 27, 28, that happened after this letter was written. So Paul was ultimately in 4 shipwrecks, right? Not the sort of person you want to get on a boat with, right? You get on the boat with somebody and says, oh, I've been in 3 shipwrecks, hope this isn't another one. No, I'm getting off this plane, right? I'm getting off this ship. But 3 shipwrecks really indicates how dangerous travel was when you're talking about movement along the coast in a boat in 1st century AD. Very dangerous. 3 shipwrecks, and at one time a night and a day in the deep, in the sea. We don't know anything about that. All we know is what Paul tells us here, that he's giving his resume of suffering for the gospel, his resume of suffering for the ministry of reconciliation. And then the next one is about danger, risk. He's risked himself, he's endangered himself, or as he conducts his ministry of reconciliation in imitation of the gospel of Christ, he encounters all sorts of dangers. And he lists all these dangers, like that he encountered in his frequent journeys. Dangers from rivers, bandits. I mean, being robbed on the road was not an uncommon sort of thing. Crossing rivers is always a dangerous sort of thing. And in danger from my own people and from Gentiles. The hostility that might occur that was occasioned on different situations. Danger in the city, in the wilderness, and on the sea. Kind of covers it, doesn't it? Everywhere I go, there's risk. Everywhere I go, there's danger. Sometimes it's danger from the elements. Sometimes it's danger from people. Sometimes it's danger just because it's a journey through the wilderness, you might say. Remember what Paul's doing here. This is his resume for his ministry of reconciliation. How he is a minister of Christ. He is willing to experience these dangers, to risk these dangers. He's willing to receive the hostility of others for the sake of the gospel. And he's willing to endure and undergo struggles in his ministry, the struggles that are listed in verse 27, in toil and hardship. I think probably toil and hardship probably refers to his working with his hands, his bivocational kind of approach to Corinth particularly. That he was a leather worker, which is hard work. It's toil, it's hard labor. And Paul is willing to do that, even when he could be a client of a patron, which he refuses in Corinth, right? Refuses to be the client of a patron. But he chooses to work hard with his hands for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the Corinthian situation. Not only hardship and toil, but sleepless nights, which could come from any sort of, it could come from the dangers that are involved. It could come from the anxiety that he has for the care of the churches. It could be from the elements in which he was situated that night. It's hard to sleep in the middle of a boat that's undergoing a storm, for example. But it also says, hungry and thirsty, without food, often without food, cold and naked. In other words, as he works for his own livelihood, and as he is engaged in these travels and experiences these different dangers and risks, he can be hungry and thirsty. He's not going to have all the food he needs necessarily. He's going to be cold, naked. He's going to be without clothing, proper clothing. And what's the point? This is what I endure for the sake of the gospel. This is what makes my ministry better. This is what is more about my ministry in comparison to the super apostles. It may be that super apostles did not claim any suffering. They may have some. Maybe that's why Paul says more. But it seems to me that super apostles are generally boasting in their credentials, in their rhetoric, in their capacity, their abilities, or their letters of recommendation, commendation. But Paul doesn't pull all that stuff out. Rather, he pulls out this sense of endurance, to endure the suffering for the sake of the gospel. That's what makes him a better minister of Christ. And that's where we got to come back to Christ there, right? Because the ministry of Jesus is a ministry that endured hardship. Is a ministry that endured hostility, that was in danger of the elements. 40 days in the wilderness, for example, right? That received a flogging, right? And was crucified. Jesus engaged in a ministry that was willing to suffer, that he came to give his life as a ransom for many. Right? And so it is a ministry of suffering. The ministry of reconciliation is a ministry that endures suffering for the sake of the goal. And I think that's what Paul is saying here, that he is a better minister of Christ because of his willingness. It's not that one has to have all this in order to be a minister of Christ or even to be a good minister of Christ. Rather, in contrast to the super apostles, his ministry is not rooted in some kind of credentialing, but his ministry is rooted in the imitation of the ministry of Christ, which exposes him to all sorts of suffering and danger and risk. And he is willing to do that in such a way that he gives up certain rights and privileges, such as the client patron privilege, for the sake of the gospel. But I think in saying all that, Paul really is getting to the very next point, that this is the climax. This is where he's leading us. I'm willing to endure all of this for the sake of the gospel. But here's my main concern. It's even partly why I'm telling you this. My main concern are 3 points that he makes in verses 29 and 30, where he says, besides other things. I could go on with telling you about other stories, list other things, but here, this is the point. I am under daily pressure because of my anxiety for all the churches. And I want us to notice the progression here. He begins with this anxiety or care or concern, might be part of those sleepless nights. He's worried. He loves the Corinthians. He loves the churches. And so his energy, his emotional energy is taken up in this concern for the church. So much so we can call it some kind of anxiety. It's kind of the anxiety that one might have, or the concern or care that one might have for a daughter who's endangered. A parent might have for a child who's endangered, which is exactly Paul's situation with Corinth, right? Because he's already said here at the beginning of chapter 11 that he's like a father who wants to present a virgin daughter to the groom, to Christ. And so he's a father who is wanting to preserve the purity, but wanting to preserve the health and the wholeness of his daughter, to protect her from danger, protect her from harm. And Paul has that same anxiety for Corinth and for all churches, he says. But then notice what he does next. It's kind of like, okay, you got that step. Let me tell you a further concern I have. Let me particularize that a little bit more, where he says, who is weak? And I am not weak. Hear what Paul is saying. It's sort of like that 1 Corinthians 9 text when Paul says, or is it 10? 1 Corinthians where he says, I become all things to all people. I think that's 9. I become all things to all people. To the weak, I am weak. I become weak for the weak, that I might win some to Christ. Paul says, I have a concern for all the churches, but in this situation, notice what's going on. I am becoming weak for the weak. I am telling you my story of endurance, the weakness that the dangers and the risk that I've endured. But I'm concerned about the weak in the church, and I'm going to become weak for their sake. When I'm ministering to the weak, I become weak, which is the gospel, right? In chapter 13, Paul is going to describe Jesus as one who became weak. The weakness in terms of the cross The cross was not this place where he displayed his triumphal power in the sense of destroying the Romans or coming off the cross and calling on the angels. No, he was weak. He died. He suffered. And so Paul is willing to become weak for the sake of the weak. That's that humbling that he talked about earlier. In contrast to domineering, controlling, manipulating, Paul humbles himself and becomes weak in imitation of Jesus Christ, who, though he was in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to exploit to his own advantage, but humbled himself and became a human being, a servant, came in the form of a servant, which is what Paul is saying here. I am a servant of Jesus, and I pursue ministry in the same way that Jesus did. And so when the weak are present, I become weak. I don't dominate, I don't domineer, I don't subjugate, I don't kick people off the bus, I don't throw them under the bus. I become weak with them in order that I might win them to Christ. And then notice the third point that Paul makes here. Anxiety for the churches, his practice of becoming weak for the weak. But then his statement that says, who is made to stumble? And I am not indignant. We hear something of Paul's anger here. Actually, the word is burns. When the weak are caused to stumble, or whoever is caused to stumble, presumably the weak, we're kind of, okay, I become weak for the weak, but now what happens when the weak stumble? Paul says, I get mad. I burn, literally is what he says. I burn. That's my gut response. That's my natural response. That's my response of the gospel, to burn against those who cause others to stumble. And you may be thinking about these super apostles in particular here, who through their domineering, manipulative, exploitive ways have used the weak, exploited the weak, and have caused the weak to stumble. And Paul says, and I burn when that happens. When I see people in a church, the strong in the church, dominate, domineer, and exploit, and run roughshod over the weak, such that the weak stumble and they lose their faith, I get angry about that. I burn, Paul says. Now, remember, stumbling here is not about, oh, I got offended by that sermon, or I got offended by the praise team, or I got offended by, what somebody said at the Lord's table, or I got offended by some brother who didn't treat me courteously when I came in the door. I wasn't welcomed by a greeter, or we're not talking about that kind of petty stuff. We're talking about when something happens in the community that creates a context where the weak fall from the faith, where the weak are destroyed so that they have no faith. We're talking about how the strong can act in such a way that they undermine and subvert and destroy the faith of the weak so that the weak are left to die. That's what we're talking about. It's the sort of thing when a person is abused in a church, and that abuse by the strong is not reconciled and corrected the abused may end up losing their faith because of how the strong treated them, how the strong reacted and responded. It may be that some people lose their faith because there's a celebrity pastor who just throws them under the bus, whom they trusted. They thought, oh, this is a godly man. This is a godly person. And they treated me like that. They kicked me off the bus. They mistreated me. They abused me. Whether it's emotional abuse, sexual abuse, whatever kind of abuse we're talking about. When that happens in a church where the strong don't respond well to it, and the abused, and we're not just talking about abused in the sense, as a narrow category, but a broad category. But the point is still the same, that when the strong abuse the weak in whatever form that may come, and the weak are caused to stumble, Paul says, I get mad about that. Am I not indignant? It reveals something of the emotion that Paul feels about these super apostles and what they're doing in the Corinthian community. They are destroying the faith of some. And that angers Paul. And it ought to anger us as well. When we see that kind of abuse going on, when we see that kind of exploitation going on, that kind of manipulation going on, so that it destroys the faith of the weak, it ought to anger us. We ought to burn within and say, I got to do something about that. And that's why 1 Corinthians 10 through 13 has such a hard edge, such a polemical edge, confrontational edge. It's because Paul is burning over what is happening to the people he cares about, like a parent cares for their children. And Paul is angry and will act to do something about it. Our anger doesn't mean that we kind of sit in it and hold grudges and let it turn to bitterness. Our anger means that we are moved to do something about the situation that has angered us, and to do it as ministers of Christ, to do it in ways that imitate Christ, so that we might participate in the ministry of reconciliation. May God give the church eyes to see, hearts to love, and wisdom to act. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen.